Um, we didn't get a chance to meet in person, but we did have a telephone conversation. So I had made a short list of things that I wanted to ask you this morning. And so I'll just ask you a question and you can launch into your long answer if you wish. And then you can ask me a question back if you wish.
Sure.
Um, when I read about you, I was interested to see that you are vitally concerned with health care, badger care, child care. Um, and I wondered if it was those issues that led you to run for office.
So I'm incredibly proud to be a single mother. And when my son George was born, I was still line cooking at a restaurant that used to be downtown called Restaurant Muramoto. And as a line cook, I was probably making, just under what qualifies you for Badger Care. So being on Badger Care is what allowed me to get all of my pre-maternal care and then a couple months of postpartum care, and have like the most amazing team help me when my son was born, actually at the same hospital that I was born in.
Huh.
So care work, when it comes to badger care, long-term care, child care, is incredibly personal for me. And I think right now, we need to be focusing on healthcare and the care economy. It is a crisis here in Wisconsin where after the July 1st deadline, where the original ARPA funds that the governor had allocated for childcare providers to use to help keep their centers open, pay educators in their programs a living wage, that those funds are going to be done. And so, right now in the budget process, Democrats and I are fighting for that childcare funding to be included in the state budget. And then, when it comes to long term care and caregiving, these are incredibly emotionally draining, labor intensive jobs, where many folks in my generation, the sandwich generation, are looking for both childcare and elder care or having to do both. And we're losing a caregiving workforce because we're not valuing some of the most important people in our society. And those are folks who are caring for some of the most vulnerable, including the disability community and the senior community and anyone else who is, we're all temporarily able-bodied. So when each of us needs care because we have a disability, we have to collectively invest in the care economy and make healthcare, quality care available to all. And so and then I'll also mention paid leave. I mean, paid leave is a huge part of the care economy. And we saw during the COVID pandemic how critical it is for folks to have the ability to care for themselves and their loved ones and not have to choose between care and their job. And we also saw that folks who needed sick leave, many of them did not have access to it, especially if you were working in the service sector, as a retail worker. And so these were all issues that I didn't quite know a lot of the policy about, but I was in a community that was lacking opportunity to have this. I mean, I didn't even know about how to create a 401k for myself, let alone navigate the Badger Care system if it wasn't help from folks in Medicaid who work as healthcare navigators. And there are actually a couple who are specific to the service industry, and that's the industry that I come from. So that's my long answer as to why the care economy and talking about care work is so important. But it is only kind of a small part of why I ran for office. So I, during the 2020 pandemic, when the pandemic started in 2020, I was working in my restaurant. I owned the restaurant Morris Ramen for just under 8 years. And we shut down as soon as the shelter in place order came in. And I was grieving and in deep fear for my employees, wondering how we were going to sustain the business so we could keep our employees and serve our community. I didn't know what was going to happen with unemployment insurance for my staff and myself. Um, but I refuse to let this grief and fear bring my community down. And so I think sometimes when you're in a position of chaos and crisis, there's a desire and actually a demand for change. And so I started organizing. I've been an organizer for a while, founded things like the Culinary Ladies Collective, worked to make sure that folks who are underrepresented in the service industry could have places of solidarity and opportunities to advance, like women, queer folks, and non-binary folks. Um, and I wanted to help the micro businesses and women-owned businesses by organizing people into space where they could share resources and stories. And then I also started a program called Cook It Forward, which raised funds, private funds, and allowed restaurants to use those funds to pay their workers to make meals that would be delivered straight to the doors of those who had to shelter in place and were unable to access meals. And so working in these direct services and serving community with nourishment, what I knew, which is food and beverage, I think folks saw that they could trust someone like me because we were having a failure in leadership when Republicans were undermining public health and the governor. And I was angry. And so I harnessed some of that anger and got a push from the community, who I think, again, being in this crisis themselves, wanted change in leadership. And so I ran on a platform of community care, of being a mother and a small business owner, because I think these lived experiences are deeply missing. I'm a proud working class worker, and it's not always the folks the people who represent us don't always bring those lived experiences to the decision-making table. So you could say it was grief and chaos and anger that compelled me to run, and my success in winning that election came from a community that supported me and loved me. And I am born and raised in Madison, and so I have deep ties to this city. I want to challenge the city. I want to help solve a lot of the problems. And the way to do that a lot of the times is making sure that the state, which holds the purse strings and provides resources for municipalities, does their job. Um, so and I still really believe in those values of lived experiences, helping to bring solutions to problems that impact everyone. And I'm incredibly proud still to be a service industry worker, still bartending and cooking where I can. When I'm not in the capital or out in the community organizing. So it's all those things, and really just this centering of shared humanity and care, which all those things that you mentioned, Pat, around childcare, caregiving, paid leave, um, uh, healthcare. These are all things that I think weren't always accessible, or the education around it wasn't accessible. A lot of folks in the community that I was from in hospitality and service didn't know who their state rep was or what the state legislature did. And I think it's really important to make government accessible to those folks, not just on an education level, but a relatability. And so when we have more working class candidates representing us, I think we make government actually more democratic. Um, and that's what I wanted to do. And also when you're in a time of chaos and crisis, sometimes you do some impulsive, crazy stuff. And mine was to run for office and continue to serve my community.
But and I listen to you and I keep going, but you didn't know anything. You didn't know how the government worked. You didn't know, how did you know how to do, I mean, how to even start? Obviously, you talk to people, but How did you find out all those things? I often think that I ought to take a civics class to figure out how the government runs and or how a bill gets introduced and gets passed
Mm,
and that sort of thing. I don't know that. And how did you find out? I mean, here you were, the owner of a restaurant, you knew a lot of people in the service
mhm.
industry, but how did you know to take those steps towards government?
Well, they say you have to ask a woman 7 times before they decide to run for office. And Madison is one of the most politically engaged communities, I would say, in the state. And so the people who asked me to run, some of them were actually patrons of mine in the restaurant who actually worked in the building, either as staffers or some of them were elected officials. Um, so when I had questions about like how am I supposed to do this? I don't know anything about running a campaign and what sort of paperwork to file and I have I know that I hate Robin Voss and what he's doing, but besides that, there's a lot of the gears and internal kind of sausage making work that I don't know. And this community really stepped up, and I brought into my campaign team people I knew, a former bartender uh, who decided to go study political science and then came on. His background was in design as well. So he helped with all of my branding and graphics. Chris Taylor, who was my predecessor, I talked to her and she told me about this really sharp young intern that she had. And I took a chance on her, even though she'd never run a campaign, um, because I knew that be, she would she had a work ethic that I think was unmatched, and Chris knew that too. So she became my campaign manager. And then I had folks who worked in the building be so generous with asking me a lot, like answering so many of my questions about how the legislature worked. And it was like drinking from a fire hose. There is so much to take in. And unfortunately, with how divisive and inequitable the Republicans make this place, I only had one staff to help me with thousands of constituent letters, and I had to read bills that I really needed to take extra time on. I would be in the restaurant researching after I was done with my shift. And, it was the first time I was using Microsoft Outlook since probably my only office desk job. And so, how I learned to do this was asking for help, community being willing to come in. I think folks in the building kind of knew that someone like me who would be unapologetic about who I am, but could do what one of the most important parts of politics is that we don't talk about, which is building trusted relationships. And I had relationships from folks all from all different industries, where I could be a pollinator and help bring them in and connect them to not only state government, but in a time like COVID, you needed collaboration and trusted collaboration. So I'm still learning to this day. I try to keep reading the Assembly Rules book before every session, and I read the Wisconsin Constitution before every session. And I think that I owe a lot to Nada Makashvi, who's my chief of staff, and so many other staffers here in the building who were really generous with. I mean, these are folks who are political science majors and graduates from public policy schools. And so anytime a legislator is doing a good job, it's because they have an amazing staff who are making them look really good. And I was fortunate to have that as well. So during the campaign, there were a lot of people who not only gave me great campaign advice and strategy advice around fundraising and building name recognition, which I had a little bit of a leg up on, But once I got in here, it was just a lot of trying to catch up because a lot of the incumbents and other folks who were coming from office backgrounds, not service industry, it took me a little bit longer to understand how to draft and work with people like the Legislative Reference Bureau, which helps draft bills, the Legislative Council, attorneys that help with interpreting bills, and you know, Chris Taylor again, her former staffer, who like ended up working for a different office would constantly come in and help because she had all of Chris's work saved. And so I really got to understand how Chris represented the district and then what that gave me a great foundation for how can I bring in even more people to this process, folks who were in the service industry, educators, folks who might be unemployed. Those were all the people that donated to my campaign. So I owed it to them to make sure I was working on legislation that would help serve them. And so this is still a learning process, but it only works when people work together. Because especially Democrats being in the minority, we have to work smarter.
Well, it's amazing because you became a community organizer because you needed to. I don't think that's usually the path that a lot of people take into politics. Um, you've mentioned your community a number of times, and I know primarily you're talking about the, I'll say, culinary community, but you represent a very interesting district as
Mhm.
well, a very diverse district. Talk a little bit about the district and the people that you represent, the variety.
Yes, we have immense diversity in the 76th district. We have folks who are from different socioeconomic classes. We have, while it's a majority white district, Asian Americans are actually the second demographic in the district. We have, and that Asian American population in Wisconsin is growing. Um, we have a lot of folks who are, uh, working class and people who uh, are retirees. There's a vast number of different constituents that I have. And I think when I focus a lot on the fact that when we have legislation that is um, driven by the needs of some of the most underrepresented and vulnerable, especially when it comes to housing, public education, and climate, it actually benefits everyone. So when I have a lot of educators in my district, and they talk to me quite often about the need to fund public schools, and then so do property owners. And we have, Madison is a majority renter city. And so issues around housing and high rent and policies with landlords, that's also top of mind for folks. And so when I'm navigating, and I'm a renter myself, so I'm navigating kind of what property owners may be saying versus what renters are saying, versus what administrators are saying in public schools versus what education educators are. It's incredibly important to listen to all those perspectives, but generally my response is, you know, making investments in policies that really help address the wealth disparities as well as looking at how I'm going to go back to public education too, because that's where my heart and soul is. Um, that when we invest in and when we meet the needs of all kids, it real and the heart of communities, it's not like these are policies that help both renters and property owners. The other part of a way that I work to represent, and I think I can better represent a very diverse community, is I have to work closely with local officials, right? So the more local a elected official is, the closer they are to the doorstep and eager to listen and try to work on policy. And so I needed to build relationships with alders, with school board members who are probably hearing more directly and often from folks in the city than even I was. And so when I work with them and they're telling me what some of the issues and that folks are talking about, I have to figure out how to get resources to them from the state, potentially accelerating conversations between like state agency, Department of Health, and folks who are working in the city. Or sometimes I just because there isn't a great pathway to passing legislation in this bureaucratic space and also being in the minority, I kind of have to use my muscle and I accelerate connections and conversations between federal electeds and my constituents or between local electeds who are, if I can't provide a policy, I can at least do solidarity and advocacy. So it might look like a letter from my community to help an EMS worker who's advocating for his own healthcare, I remember. So representing a very diverse district, while there's a lot of compartmentalization I have to do around the issues, I kind of always go back to when we invest in low income and social housing, when we fund our public schools, when we make sure that there are investments in public transit, as well as Madison is a huge bike community. That these sort of investments, while they seem to only serve a certain community, it ends up making the city a much more vibrant, dynamic, livable place. And when it comes to climate too, I think we've got so many clean water champions here in Madison. But oftentimes it's, doing that extra outreach of making sure the folks who are doing fishing at Monona or Wabisa or Wingra have information about potential contaminants, which is going directly to folks who may not know about PFAS contamination or what's going on with our water. So it's part outreach, it's lots of conversations, it's relationship building with local officials, and sometimes I just have to be an ear for folks, really affirming their potential fears and feelings about what how they're feeling about what's going on in their neighborhood, and also the neighborhood. I'm I need to develop good relationships with neighborhood groups. And so, whether it's trying to make it to the Marquette Neighborhood Association's meeting or the Northside Planning Council, I'm headed to Maple Bluff in August for office hours and happy hour. It's really important that I meet people where they are, and that helps me try to kind of build those relationships where a diverse community, and then talk about issues at the state that do impact everyone, whether it's on voting, whether it's right now with the budget and different legislation that I might be working on, like childcare, like universal paid leave. I'm the original author of both universal paid leave and universal healthy school meals. Um, and talking about those policies as it's not just serving one section, one community in the 76th district. It's a way to help everyone.
That world view, I guess, that big view, big picture view, makes all of the small things you work on be very visible. But I'm curious
Mhm.
to ask you. It just seems amazing to me that you learned so much in so short of period of time. Um, I also, when I looked into some of the things that you do, and this relates in some way to climate change, but I noticed that you're active in an organization called Rooted.
Mhm.
Um, and we had Hetty speak here
Oh,
some time ago.
mhm.
And when she went, before they changed the area that her kids all worked in, at the school. And it's organizations like that, um, that make a difference, statewide, community-wide, worldwide. Can you talk about Rooted a little bit and how it fits in with what you do?
Absolutely. I completely had missed how important it is to develop relationships with organizations that are doing both direct services work, educating and advocacy work, and outreach. They are an incredibly important part of being able to build connection with communities. Rooted has an incredibly special place in my heart. They are an organization committed to growing, nourishing community by doing urban ag education, investing and taking care of lands, whether it's Troy Farms or other parcels that are surrounding in the Madison area, and also food system work. And so those three pieces are often uh, I would say underestimated in terms of how important they are to help people grow in their community and feel like they're a part of a community. And the youth programming at Rooted is, I think, what is one of the most important elements in what we do there, whether it's at Badger Rock Community Center, where the urban ag farm is, our urban school farm is there, and students have an opportunity to literally get their hands in the dirt, learn about agriculture, and then take actually take some of those foods and create meals. And I was fortunate to be a culinary instructor, and other chefs come in and help students learn kind of basics about how to make food, why it's so important to learn about where our food comes from, and start nourishing and acknowledging how we have to protect the lands, and as well as protect the farmers who are working to make sure that we have food. When it comes to land preservation, one of the most magical places in the city is Troy Farms. And to have community gardens in the middle of the city where we've got Black, Caribbean, Native, Hmong farmers who are able to translate and show their culture through the different vegetables, fruits, and crops that they're growing, that helps actually not only bring community together in understanding these foodways, but it's an opportunity for those folks to have a lot of pride in being a part of the and feeling more a part of the community. Troy Gardens and Troy Farm also have a wonderful CSA. They do education as well on the farm with school groups, and have a great relationship with both Lakeview Elementary School and Kennedy Heights Community Center. So Rooted has this programming that brings community together with enrichment for youth, understanding of urban agriculture, and broadening the conversation about what makes healthy food systems. Because if we don't invest in healthy food systems right now, in how we procure foods and build relationships with small farmers, especially in the wake of big ag and actually very unregulated, unhealthy food in our coming in mass quantities. Understanding that we actually have a food system here in Madison that more people can nourish. It's beyond just going to the farmers markets. It's actually seeing the work at Rooted. And so this year I serve as the board president, and a lot of what we are doing is seeing the success of this programming and working in collaboration with other groups like REAP, the Madison School District, even some business partners, and building a strong volunteer program. And again, helping people feel like they can grow in a community, pun intended, but that also there are opportunities to nourish the people that they care about. And that I can't say enough about that urban ag education piece. I think it's very unique and something that so many of our youth want to understand but don't always have opportunity to. And I hope that we are championing and providing opportunities for those folks to go into farming, horticulture, or at least show that community gardens and urban agriculture belongs to everyone.
You know, you've just described, in this small segment, you've just described how your attitude towards public service works. In Rooted, you're working with children, you're working with the land, you're working with the community, and it spreads out all the way to our concern about climate care. So it works. I see now how you're doing this. Um, you also are very involved, as you started to say before, with education. How old is your child?
George just turned 9 years old. He'll be
Oh,
a fourth grader at Marquette Elementary this fall.
okay. And so you're involved in nourishment and concern, and I see it working across so many elements. Are you, I guess, how do you keep going and not be discouraged? And you've mentioned Robin Voss, but with that whole um, attitude against anything that seems to work in favor of the everyday person. How do you keep on going? Is it your community that nourishes you?
Yeah, I always say, and I believe this to my core, that I can continue in this work because I truly do love this community with all of its flaws and also all of its glories. Um, and the community loves me back.
Ah,
Sometimes that love is shown in ways where they challenge me and disagree on a vote that I make or a statement that I have. Um, that challenge is also love. Uh, Being able to, like, making me feel like I belong and seeing some of the work that's happening in the community around climate, around education, around childcare. To me, I really do consider that community love. And right now, there is a crisis of apathy and also grief in the state of our world, the Trump regime, and growing fascism. And I think, especially when we see that as the status quo and we're not able to change, right? A lot of the political decisions that have been made by national Republicans, national Democrats, it feels like there's such a reluctance for change, especially systemic change. So I think it's okay to feel that grief and apathy. Um, but I think we each have to reject that it's going to be something that brings us down. Because as a collective, maybe, I always say it's like the community when it's fighting back, when we are in resistance, and I think resistance is really beautiful. Like a choir, when we're holding one note, when we're part of a movement, people kind of take their breaths at different times. And so when someone has to kind of be in that grief and in that helplessness or hopelessness, I know there's still a big choir of folks who are holding that note and trying to finish the song. And this is my mother is
that
a music educator, and so that's it's kind of how I always I try to operate with music being a place where I can find a lot of peace. But I know we're gonna reject the. Um, I refuse to let that grief bring the collective down, and so I have to keep going, knowing that joy and love is its own form of resistance. And I'm also very fortunate to have, again, a team with me here in the legislature, people I trust, people who will hold me accountable when I'm feeling um, uh, apathy and hopelessness. And then I remind myself I have to stay nauseously optimistic, especially since we've got the majority, within reach. I think 2026 is going to be a very powerful year for change. And again, that change is coming from crisis. It's what drove me to run for office in the first place. And then outside of the legislature, my parents actually still live in my childhood home. They immigrated here, um, gonna share my age now, 36 years ago. And they've lived in Madison longer than anywhere else in their life, including their home country of Korea. And so I have family who also love this community. And all of this, a lot of this I have to do for my son and the kids. And we have completely betrayed our kids when it comes to legislation that has passed in this building. And so it is community, Pat, that keeps me going. And I think the community does it in a lot of different ways.
Obviously it is. I also um, speak for a whole range of women like me, with who are frustrated or concerned to one degree or another, and feel helpless. You felt helpless and you rallied against that. So I have to ask you some questions. Do you think that demonstrations help? Do you think they make a difference?
Protests always make a difference. It's not just about sharing the message, it's about showing the message, and it's about really paying attention to who that message is coming from. So at a protest, you have a broad range of folks. They may be like, just take the No More Kings protest, right? You had leftists, you had centrists, you had scientists, you had mothers, all demanding that, democracy and the end of a regime and rejecting oligarchy. And I think showing that is really important. And whether it's the pictures of those rallies and people seeing them who may not have been there, that showing part is really important. But protest is, it's a form of direct democracy, so it's always important. But protest isn't always something that is accessible to everyone or comfortable to everyone. And so we have to remember that every action matters. And I'm telling people a lot when I travel around the state, and I've been really fortunate to do Medicaid town halls and roundtables in places like Wild Rose, Wisconsin, and Ripon, Wisconsin. I'll be in Kakana on Thursday. Um, and these smaller communities are seeing hundreds of people turn out for protests. They are training organizers who want to figure out how best to advocate for issues that they care about, how to be the best storyteller, right? When someone comes in to lobby me about a bill, I remember someone telling me a personal story about why a policy impacts them directly. When the students from Milwaukee Public Schools came and talked about the lack of investment in mental health services and what that meant for their student body and their peers. I remember that meeting. We all have to be storytellers, and we can, thanks to social media, even though social media is also incredibly destructive, folks are sharing their very personal, vulnerable Medicaid stories or stories about, what happens when a school closes in a neighborhood. That vulnerability is very powerful because you're telling someone else that they're not alone and that they can be a part of this movement just by sharing a story. And then lastly, the hyper-localized organizing is incredibly important. So it was local organizing in those small towns that helped bring out hundreds of people in a town of maybe 5, 6,000 to a protest. That that means people can continue, right? After the protest, it's kind of like, now what do we do? Um, I go back to time, talent, and treasure. There are going to be some folks who are able to fund legal groups. One of the ways we're really fighting back, and Josh Call, the Attorney General, briefed us earlier, is we have to fight the regime in the courts. So donating to ACLU, donating to groups that are protecting our communities who are most vulnerable to the immigration terrors, donating to places like Centro Hispano and Voces, and those treasures, someone might take the treasure lane. The talent is assessing what you can offer. Maybe, you're a data analyst, you know how to do data entry, and you can help people organize their phone trees and, different spreadsheets that are going to help organizers kind of be able to centralize information. You might be someone who's a really great communicator, and you can write talking points about how people can advocate. You might be someone who it a chef or a quilter, and you're able to gather folks for times of just, solidarity, and hosting a dinner party or training people on organizing or teaching people how to quilt. Like, these moments of community really matter too. And then, what did I say? Time, talent, time. Uh, you have to assess your capacity, what's going to help me be sustainable, because we're going to need people to be in movement work for years. And especially when we want to make systemic changes, we have to take the time to look at what elders and former civil rights movements and the people who have been trying to, bend the arc towards justice. We have to take that time to educate ourselves on that. We have to take the time to engage in where our local elections are and who's running for local office, or to run for office yourself, and assess the time and capacity you have for that. um, I keep in mind the time, talent, treasure, and I think protest also falls into that time area, right? So organizing looks different for everyone, but every piece of organizing matters right now.
Wow, that is an invitation to commitment if I've ever heard it. Thank you.
Of
Thank
course.
you. Um, the I have to say, you are definitely, from what I consider at my age, the younger generation.
Oh,
Um,
thank you for saying that. I
so
don't feel young these days, but appreciate it.
we all recognize that feeling. But um, I have to ask you, as a representative, and I know this is putting you on the spot. Tell me, is this coming generation gonna save us? Do you feel are there more people like you, who are alders? I see a lot of young alders, but I also see a lot of white-haired guys, you know? So, um, is there hope from your generation?
I think my generation, we have been forced into resiliency, and the generations after me have also been forced into resiliency. We're seeing my first protest was walking out of West High School to protest the Iraq War. There was the first, the 2008 economic crash, the inability for so many folks in my generation to become homeowners, and maintain, salaries that help us with our student loan debt. I think, I'm not sure if our resiliency is going to save our communities, but I do think that there is a lot to learn from the incoming generations and the younger generations. And I think too often, as you said, a lot of white-haired men, stepping aside doesn't seem to be um, a proud sacrifice. I think sacrifice is a part of politics and being an elected official, and that sacrifice is not, is something to be proud of when you know when to step aside. And I think younger generations often feel as though there's some ageism there, right? What sort of wisdom and experience could you be bringing if you're only 21 years old? But again, we have to look at that element of forced resiliency and how much our college students, many of them graduated during a pandemic. Everyone endured a pandemic. Everyone is enduring a mental health crisis. So they, their resiliency is only going to grow. And I think there's going to be I always remind folks when I talk to young people, I remind them that they don't need permission to lead. And so I think bold leadership is going to come from the younger generations, and that is going to help us make strides and in our movement work towards justice and a world where everyone feels safe and can thrive. Um, they have that vision, even though apathy is probably the only response to have when you grew up with shooting, like, school shooting drills. So I think save, I don't know, but learning from them and supporting them and making sure to validate their actions and their feelings, affirming that can be a way that we can come together in community and collaboration to hopefully save ourselves.
Yes.
But yeah, when I was just at an event with middle schoolers who were in essentially a speech competition, um, and their speeches were poignant and very honest about the realities around civic engagement to sexual assault and discrimination of the queer community and addressing all of those in ways that actually had an action item at the end of their speech. Um, so I think, and while sometimes I worry the youth are, I don't understand the lingo all the time, and maybe they're taking things too lightly or nonchalantly. They're also very keenly aware of the different traumas, if you will, that they've had to live through and kind of normalize. And it's going to make them stronger, whether they want to think that or not. It makes them more resilient. I wish we didn't have to force that resiliency, but that's going to make for bolder, stronger leadership. And so that part I really believe in, and that I think will be a part of helping us have collective safety and moving us to a place and a shared vision where we feel saved.
Well, Francisca, you give me hope. Um, I'm an optimist, I think, but I've not felt very optimistic, and you give me some hope. And I have to ask you one last question. Um, I notice that you are very committed to your district and working for issues that are paramount in the district. But I also see or hear you say that you are moving around the state, learning from other areas, learning to even represent other areas. Um, I hope that you're going to stay in government. Is that part of your plan?
My plan right now is to win back the majority, have a Democratic trifecta in the legislature, and make sure that we are aggressive in passing transformative legislation, much like our neighbors in Minnesota did. And I I love this community and I love this state, and I'm really proud of our state and the work ethic and the values we share. And I've seen when I go from rural or urban to suburban communities, there is a lot more that we share and unites us. But we've had policies like not having trains or pitting rural against urban
Mm.
with who has resources and who doesn't. Um, my plan is if government is the way that I can help people recognize that we are stronger together, that every Wisconsinites deserve an opportunity to care for themselves and their families and their neighborhoods um, in a way where everyone can thrive. And right now, I think for me, the most effective way to do that is both in the capital and organizing in community. Um, but we're one of the reasons I'm going to some of these districts is because I want Democrats to start chipping away at some of these really red areas. That was a Republican strategy in 2024. It wasn't about winning Dane County, it was about increasing votes in Dane County for Republicans. And so while it's very important because we need 5 seats to get that majority. So we have to protect some of our most competitive seats where Democrats only won by a percentage point or half a percentage point, and then we have to flip 5 districts from Republican to Democrat. So there's going to be a lot of resources and conversation around that. But I think a number of us, and I know my fellow Democratic Socialists and I really want to start make chipping away at deep red districts. And I think because we have such a commitment to working class issues, there's a lot more that the left shares with more moderate blue collar folks when it comes to policies that uh, are not are what we know is going to help. Public education, healthcare, get jobs guarantee, living wage, affordable housing. There are policies that we can push that does that very quickly. And we have to be talking about what we can deliver, what we're fighting for, and not just what we're fighting against. And so
Wow.
I think government is where I can do a lot of that work. But what I do outside of these marble walls are probably even more important.
Well, I think you've educated us in a number of ways that we haven't looked at before, but you certainly, more than that, set an example of someone who cares and then takes action. You have my support, I'll tell you that. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think that we'll run into each other sooner or later, probably at a demonstration. So
I look forward to it. I so look forward to it. And I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, there it is. But I am happy to continue this conversation. Pat has my information for both the office and my phone number. If folks would like to come to the office or I can meet you in your neighborhood, I'm always very eager to talk to folks who care. And I think everyone on this call really cares. So feel
good.
free to reach out.
I'll share your information with everybody, and your very valuable assistant, Nada, is going to make sure that everybody gets the
Yes,
information.
yes, Nada is fantastic, and a lot of the information and the work that I'm doing is on my social media pages, and so both my legislative one, which is State Representative Francesca Hong, um, Francesca Hong for Assembly is my campaign one. That page is a little bit spicier and talks about, I think there's a video of me in Education Committee, and even though I'm the ranking Democratic member, the Republican chair interrupts me, disrespects me, and I think it's important for folks to see
Oh,
that
my goodness.
who they are and how they behave in a public hearing. So, and then we've got a really great email list. I promise it's not all, it's very few of them are donation ones. I try to either elevate other organizations, tell people what's going on in the community, and once in a while ask for support, or I'm selling merch because my team really wants me to get all this merch out. And so there's lots of ways to stay connected with me. And I just want to thank you all for having these meetings and staying so engaged.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think you'll see us again.
Fantastic. I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
And you as well.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you. What can I say? I have to tell
Whoa,
you, that was a complete surprise for me, because when I spoke to Francesca earlier, She is so soft-spoken. I had no idea that there was a spine of steel there. That's amazing. So, thank you all. No, we're not